So I have to admit that when I first read today's gospel reading, I was like, really? This is what I have to preach on? It made me wonder whether lectionary should come with warning labels. Today's gospel has violence, outer darkness, and weeping and gnashing of teeth, kind of like films come with rating labels. The king in our parable, which is most often interpreted as God, is not exactly the image of the non-violent, all-loving God. It does not seem to be the image of God which I recognize. And I have to say, in comparison of Matthew's version of this with Luke's version, I want to run to Luke, because in Luke's version, there is no violence nor gnashing of teeth. And it becomes even more pointed then, why does Matthew have these lines? What is it that we are supposed to take away from Matthew's version? We are told that those who were originally invited to the feast at best ignore the invitation, and at worst took the king's messengers and killed them. To the hearers of Matthew's gospel, they would have heard in this scenario a familiar story in their life. Matthew's community, after all, consisted primarily of Greek-speaking Jews. They would have known that the destruction of Jerusalem had taken place only a couple decades before their hearing of this story. They would have heard it as a history of something that actually happened in their living memories. Part of their understanding with the relationship of God was that God allowed their temple to be destroyed. They would have been trying to wrestle with what that meant and what kind of God was it that this was part of their lives. How do they reconcile themselves to the violence that they understood embodied in their history, and not only embodied in their history in the here and now for them? For they would have been ridiculed for following Jesus, and at worst, they would have been one of the early martyrs. So the violence is not something foreign to them as it is to our hearing, but it's still troubling. It comes with this image of a God who would be equated with the king and the violence. And I have to say, I struggle with it. I do not know quite what to make of this type of God. It is one of an image that makes me desperately uncomfortable. I could sidestep it. I could just say, let's use Luke. I thought about it, believe me. It seems to me, though, underlying the image that Matthew used, because it was part of his world, is the imperative that we listen to God's call in our life and that we say yes to God. Both Matthew and Luke then share the king's instructions to their messengers to go out and invite who they meet. In Matthew, they are, "Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet." And so they did. All whom they found, both good and bad, were invited. In Luke's, the invitation is a little more contextual. He is inviting the slave, the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. Now, this is the God I can relate to. This is the God that we preach every time we stand up there. It is the God that says all are welcome to God's feast and God's table. But while I would like to remain in that place, I have to struggle again, because Matthew doesn't just do this once. He ends the wedding banquet in the outer darkness. We are told, "But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to his attendants, 'Bind him by hand and foot, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. Now, I don't know about you, but my stomach just hit the bottom. I look at those lines and go, what? How am I supposed to hear good news in this? Outer darkness, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth? We polite Episcopalians don't talk like that. We just don't. And for all things, he wore the wrong wedding garment. Now, I get that we have fashion police among us, but this is not the fashion police. What they would have understood that is lost on our ears is that the wedding garment is about Christ. For some interpreters, they understand that it is about what happens in baptism. That for Paul, we are told that we take on and we clothe ourselves in Christ when we say yes to God. And so the king, the God in this parable, is standing there looking around at the table, and all of these people, those who are marginalized and oppressed, those who are good and bad, they're all standing there, and but one out of this whole group. He looks and says, how did you get in here? You have not said yes yet. You have not said yes to the invitation of God. I don't understand. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. He does banish that person to the outer darkness. He does banish it to weeping and gnashing of teeth. In our modern day hearing, we are uncomfortable. And I want to suggest that perhaps with Matthew, we might just stay in that uncomfortableness. For in our terms, we would say they are banished in sin. They are alienated from God. We might even use the word hell, although maybe not. It is in this light that many of us are understandably uncomfortable. Many of us have grown up in churches with fire and brimstone. In my own tradition in the Roman Catholic Church, it was not so much fire and brimstone, but it was a manual of all the ways one could sin, and one understood one could sin in ordinary ways and little ways, and really big ways, and really mortal sins up here. And you understood all of this, and you memorized all of this. And it created fear and anxiety. That is not what we should hear. For in the end, where there is alienation from God, there is what the parable says all the way through. There is the invitation. That never goes away. The invitation to be and exist and come with God to God's table is always there. No matter who we are, no matter what we do, that invitation stands. Forgiveness and reconciliation are part of this story. So, what is the uncomfortable part? The uncomfortable part is that we also exist in a world of sin, no less than Matthew did. We understand it when we remember that 58 lives were taken and hundreds wounded in Las Vegas. We remember it when we look out on our streets and hundreds and thousands of people live without a roof over their head or enough food to fill their belly. This is what sin looks like in our society. And it should make us uncomfortable. And we should take the time to be in that uncomfortable place. Because our yes to God is about helping God try in little ways and big ways to eliminate that sin. And that, I don't have the answers to. I don't know that we will never make it to a perfect world. We will always live in a world of sin and struggle, and there will always be that invitation. So staying in that uncomfortable place and recognizing it is also part of our journey. It's part of our journey so that we can get to the point of saying yes. to God, and that our yes or no actually has consequences in the real world. The hope in this is that forgiveness, reconciliation, God's life, God's invitation is always there to everyone. It never goes away. It is always waiting for us. We simply have to say yes.